a good group here this afternoon. Everybody can hear that, so appreciate you being here. And we're still in the book of Hebrews, and if you were here last week, and if you can remember what we talked about last week, you know that the writer of the book of Hebrews has made somewhat of a transition at the end of chapter 10. Not a complete transition, but he has, up until this point in time, it seems to me that the writer has been encouraging, the writer has been trying to give every positive argument he can give to cause all of us to want to stay faithful to what we've been called. But then he, last week, said in very direct words, but if you're not, if you choose to go back and sin deliberately after you receive this knowledge of the truth, there's serious trouble. He says you're trotting underfoot the Son of God. You are doing despite to the Spirit of grace. And he kind of uses a little bit of rationale with us and says, what do you suppose would happen to a person who does this before God? And the outcome is very, very poor. So he's concluding chapter 10 with very direct, hard words to try to convince us to stay with what we're staying with. And I want to call your attention to the last verse of chapter 10 as we begin. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but we are of those who believe and are saved. The whole book up to this point has been about those who shrink back, who fall backwards, who go back. Now, I would be the last person, I think, to be super critical of people who shrink back. Because shrinking back or falling back is very, very easy to do. Does everyone kind of understand what I'm saying? I would not dare ever be overly critical in the sense that I'm saying, why would you do that? Because what could happen to me so easily? The same thing. I could shrink back so easily. And sometimes it's not. It's not just that we grow tired of it or we grow weary of it. There are massive forces of evil in this life, and sometimes they don't even appear to be evil, but Satan will use whichever side you fall on. He'll use whatever circumstance you're in to try to do harm to our spiritual well-being. And we are all subject to that. So I continue to find people who are in situations in life that are so heavy and so great and so hard, it's difficult for them to stay with anything. Do all of you understand that? It's difficult to stay with a job, or they can't find a job. They're in family situations, very difficult to stay in the family situation. They're in other situations, and it mounts up and mounts up and mounts up to people. People just kind of want to run. They kind of say, I can't take it anymore, and they just want it gone. I see people like that. Do you see people like that? They're everywhere. They're all over this city. People who are so burdened with life, they don't know the next steps to take. It can happen in Christianity, and Satan will try to make it happen to every one of us. But we're not supposed to be of those who shrink back and are destroyed. We are to be those people who, what did it say? Believe and are saved. That we continue to believe and are saved. So now with that statement and with that idea, he begins to present to us what faith is really supposed to look like, what faith does look like, what faith is. And faith is not always easy, a life of faith, is it? In fact, he's going to present characters and situations in chapter 11 that would make most people want to do what? Shrink back, walk away. Story after story after story is going to show us are examples of people who had life so difficult at times, it would have been easier, it seems, to walk away, but they didn't. They stayed with this thing called faith. And so he begins by talking about faith. He gives us, some people have called it the definition of faith. I think it's one possible definition of faith. But he says faith is being sure of what we hope for, certain of what we do not see. It's not always to be certain of those things that we can't see. Is it? Mm-hmm.
But you look at Noah.
Uh-huh.
Never had any rain.
Yeah.
Said Noah, go ahead and get started on this boat. There's the faith that's just done.
Yeah, and he's going to use that illustration of Noah, but it's a perfect thought, because how long do we think it took Noah to build that ark? About 100 years, right? Now, I don't know about you, but 100 years is a long time. Nell could tell us, but I'm getting close to being able to tell you. I'm getting close. 100 years is a long time. And you're telling me that I'm going to wait for 100 years and receive something I don't even understand what you're talking about? This rain's going to come, and it's going to come so much that the whole world is going to be flooded? And for 100 years, I'm going to work on this boat, this ship. And along the way, people are going to be not listening to me as I try to reason with them and preach to them. And do you think Noah ever got discouraged? Do you think he ever got tired of sawing boards? Do you ever think he looked around and thought, nobody in their right mind would be doing this? You know? And in fact, everybody in their right mind is telling him that he is crazy, it seems. And yet, how many times have we said it? The Bible and what God calls us to do continues to be illogical. Doesn't fit how normally we think. There are stories all through the Bible that just don't seem possible. Maybe Noah and the ark being one of them. Maybe that's one of them, those stories. And yet, this thing called faith is being certain of these things that we're told, even though I don't see them. So God says it's going to rain. God says there's going to be a flood. I wait all this time. I'm certain of it, even though I don't see it. And if I'm certain of it, even though I can't see it, I have an assurance. It's not just that I'm going to say I believe it. Deep in my heart, I'm sure that it's going to take place. Now that's, as we used to say, a tall order to fill. That's old language, but it's a tall order to fill. To be absolutely certain that it's going to be true. Though I don't understand how, though I don't see it, though I don't know when. That's what this faith is all about. Now look at the last line of that verse that we never quote. What does it say? This is what the ancients were commended for. Who are the ancients? Well, all those people have gone on centuries before. This, if you want to find one that's commended, they'll always be commended for their what? For their faith. That they were certain of those things that they could not see, and they were so certain and so convinced because God said it was true and it would happen, that they were sure. And they would do all kinds of things that seem strange to a normal person, because they were sure of it. Noah will build on a boat that looks like it's a crazy thing by the standard of this world, but he does it because he's what? He's certain, and he's sure that one day God's going to shut that door and he's going to be inside and everybody else is going to be outside, except for a few. That's what faith is. And the ancients were commended for it. So here again, we come to this interesting concept. What is God looking for in us? What does God respect in people? What does God want each one of us to demonstrate? Our faith. He wants us to demonstrate our faith. How much are you convinced of those things you have not seen? And how absolutely sure are you that they're real? You haven't seen them, but you still believe them and you're sure. That's where God says, that's what I want. We're going to be told that within the next few verses. Without this quality that we're trying to describe right now, you can never please God. So what we know is that God, when He sees someone who believes what He says to the point that they will go ahead and act upon it to the full extent required, God knows that person believes what they can't see and is sure of it. So you can take every character, especially the Old Testament, that we read very much about, and they are people of this thing called faith. That's why I like to study the life of Elijah. It doesn't take very long, and we'll do that one of these days before long. But it's a picture of faith until that one episode in his life when he gets so distraught, life gets so heavy, that he falls apart for a little while. And it's always been kind of comforting to me to see a man fall apart who is so mighty in his faith and then turn around after spending about 40 days in a cave and come out of that and be so great in God's sight. Now, isn't this interesting? So great in God's sight that how did he die? He didn't. That's right, he didn't. But he's the one who is whining under a tree to God saying, let me die because I'm no good. He's the one who's running, scared to death. And yet God will end up never letting him taste of death. Isn't that interesting? Even he is not perfect, but he had this quality called faith. And so we're going to try to examine over a bit of time here what faith really means from this chapter, but I don't know what kind of trails it's going to take us down, because there are stories up on top of stories that are in our heritage and in our awareness that are worthy to be examined again out of this chapter. So he says, by faith we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was made out of what was invisible. Well, you can't get past verse 3 without realizing the great tension that lies within our world today. Because by faith we understand what? What does it say? That the universe was formed, first of all, at what? God's what? God's command. And that what is seen came from that which was not visible. It wasn't here. Well, if I go about right now speaking that all over this country, what do I get labeled? Very quickly, what do I get labeled? And if I go to virtually any college or university campus that is what we call secular, state-funded, what am I going to hear? I mean, I've been reading it lately more and more, and I've had people been talking to me about it more and more, that the greatest assault on American values, on an American way of life, is taking place on our college and university campuses. Because they are preaching powerfully that anyone who would believe a statement like verse 3 is, they're not all there. Now, isn't that interesting? Because I can understand where they're coming from. Think about it. If you don't have this background, if you haven't been reading this book, and someone tells you that everything we know just happened because God spoke it into existence. And by the way, before He spoke it into existence, there wasn't anything to make it out of. Well, there wasn't a molecule. There wasn't anything. He took it all and put it all together. What would that sound like to you? I mean, yeah, it's like me going out and saying, look at that truck right there. I just snapped my fingers, it's there. It happens. It all came together. If you told me that, if you took me over to your house and showed me a new vehicle right there and said, I just popped my fingers, it was there in my driveway, what am I going to say about you? I'm going to go over to Greg and say, hey, Greg, we've got to watch this guy. He's going to be really dangerous for us, okay? And yet, we're being called as a people who think like this. And it's a real battle right now for what we call private Christian university campuses to hold to this. It's why you appreciate little schools like the College of the Ozark. The College of the Ozark has become famous because it's a non-tuition school. You get to go free. If you're willing to stay there in summer times, they'll even give you room and board free. And they only take 1,100 students. Susan and I have an invitation to be with that president in April. I don't know if we're going to go or not, but I think we are. But he's been there 42 years. He just doesn't make any bones about it. We are conservative. We are religious. We're conservative politically. And if you break our rules, we don't mind. You just can leave easily because we've got 7 people lined up to take your spot behind you. And their endowment has gone from 0 to up around $700 million right now because people like what they say. There aren't many of those schools left. There aren't many of those schools left who talk like that. But just be careful because a lot of the world would look at this verse and say, you people are nuts. But by faith, we understand how this world got here is what he's saying. That's by faith we understand it. We're committed to it. We believe it. And by faith, Abel offered a better sacrifice than Cain did. And by faith, he was commended as a righteous man when God spoke well of his offsprings. And by faith, he still speaks even though he was dead. It's the only passage in this whole chapter that I don't think I understand very well. Because I never have understood exactly why his sacrifice was better than the other. One gave first fruits, one gave grain. I never understood what made the difference in those. But there's something about the heart and something about the sacrifice and something about the engagement that was there. But when God dealt with Cain and Abel and dealt with that whole story, it appears from the book of Hebrews that he considered it what kind of an issue? This is what I want to get across. What kind of an issue? It was a faith issue. It was a faith issue. Because somewhere in what I don't understand, it appears to me that Abel believed and was convinced of what he had not seen and was sure that God was going to do something. Whereas Cain, for some reason, wasn't quite as convinced and therefore didn't offer something that was as acceptable. He wasn't as convinced, he wasn't sure, and so he thought in some format, he thought in some kind of format, I better take care of I better hedge. I'm always using these slang phrases, okay, that get me in trouble. I better hedge my bet. Y'all ever done that? Don't raise your hand. But that's kind of what he's doing. He's playing both ends. In case this is not exactly like God said, I better hold back a bit. I better do this a little differently. You see how that works? That's how we do it when we're beginning to question whether or not God's statement is it really valid? Am I really going to buy that completely? And if I don't, I do what? I protect myself some. Don't we? I do that with everything. If I go to the doctor and I don't quite trust what he said, I protect myself some by doing what? Yeah. I go get another opinion. Or I just say, I'm not doing it. I don't think it'll work. I'm just not going to do it. Everybody understand what I'm saying? So we're in for a bunch of Sunday afternoons here that should be challenging and invigorating and certainly educational about what it means to live as a faith person. I don't want to say living by faith. I don't want to say live in faith, because we use those terms so often that they just kind of glide past. But what does it really mean to be a faith person? How does a faith person really live? Because it's how God commended the ancients. And as has been pointed out in a few verses here, he's going to say, by the way, without this thing of faith in your life, like I'm talking about right here, it's impossible to have God to commend you like these ancients did, he's going to talk about. Isn't that interesting? It's another story. It's another story that you just wish they would have told you more, don't you? Don't you just wish they would have told you more?
I just don't know whether he just said, this is what I did, I'm going to give it to him. I know I'm going to trade some fruit for another sheep. I don't know if he was just a file or if he just didn't know.
I don't know either. But what this says, the only thing that sheds light on it so I can begin to understand what this says is, Abel and Cain were different before God because their faith was different. That's what he's saying right here in this passage. By faith, Abel offered a better sacrifice. That means to me he was more convinced of what God said, and he was more certain of what God said than was the other, and so they acted differently. So, I don't know. Some of these things get way beyond my ability, okay? But this is the passage that lets me have some insight to that thing I read back there and think, I don't know. Is meat better than grain? My doctor says grain is better than meat. I don't know. Which is it? So I don't understand it except for right here. It's a faith issue. And I'll promise you, our shrinking back becomes a faith issue. Because how convinced are we of things we haven't seen? How sure are we about what God has said? Shrinking back is a faith issue. That's what he's going to be saying.